October 17, 2006. Evening pressed down on New Orleans like a held breath. At 8:30 p.m. sharp, a call came through dispatch reporting a body at the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel. Someone had jumped from the roof, not fallen, but jumped. Patrol units converged on the scene within minutes. What they found wasn't a mystery, not yet anyway. It was just a corpse on concrete, broken and still. The real horror waited in a back pocket. There was a note handwritten, the kind of confession that turns your blood to slush. "This is not accidental," it began. The rest was worse, much worse. It gave an address, 826 North Rampart. It mentioned an oven. It mentioned a girlfriend named Addie. It mentioned dismemberment and documentation and a signed confession. The officers didn't hesitate. They radioed ahead. They drove fast. The apartment sat above the voodoo spiritual temple, a place where priests and priestesses sold prayers and protection. But no magic had protected Addie Hall. No ritual had saved her from what happened inside those walls. When police forced the door open, cold air poured out like exhaled breath. It was 60 degrees inside. The AC had been running for days. The walls told the story before they found the body. Spray-painted messages covered every surface. One wall, "I'm a total failure." Another, "Look in the oven." A third read, "Call Lana Bowen and tell her I love her and I'm sorry I couldn't," the sentence trailing off unfinished. And on the oven it was a final warning, "Don't look." They looked anyway, inside the oven. Limbs, arms and legs seasoned like a Sunday roast. On the stove, 2 pots. One held her head, the other contained her hands and feet, arranged like some grotesque stew. The refrigerator yielded her torso, wrapped in black plastic, shoved between the milk and yesterday's leftovers. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was methodical butchery. The dead man at the hotel was Zack Bowen. The woman in pieces was Addie Hall. Their love story, if you could call it that, had begun just over a year earlier, during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Not a meet cute, but a meet catastrophe. 2 damaged people clinging to each other while the city drowned. Addie was fire and volatility wrapped in skin. She was born in North Carolina and raised in dysfunction, sexually abused as a child, which planted seeds that would bloom into bipolar disorder years later. She moved to New Orleans in her 20s, drawn to the French Quarter like so many lost souls before her. She wrote poetry, she painted, she danced. She bartended at the Spotted Cat Music Club, pouring drinks and collecting tips and flirting through aggression. That's where Zack first saw her. He was California-born, Army-trained, recently abandoned by his wife. Lena had taken their 2 children and vanished while he was deployed. The betrayal carved him hollow. He left the service, not honorably discharged despite NATO medals and presidential citations, but with a general discharge that denied him education benefits. It was a bureaucratic insult that festered like an infected wound. He drifted to New Orleans alone, haunted by Iraq and by a young girl he'd befriended there, killed along with her entire family when their shop was bombed. PTSD wasn't just a diagnosis, it was his constant companion. Addie gave him hell from the start. She was mean. She mocked him, she made him work for every smile, but that was her way, not cruelty, but the mating dance of the emotionally damaged. And Zack, lonely and broken, mistook her chaos for passion. In August 2005, Katrina arrived like the apocalypse, a Category 5 monster. The city flooded, buildings collapsed. The government failed, but Addie and Zack stayed. They refused evacuation orders and holed up in her apartment without electricity, feeding stray cats and mixing cocktails for shell-shocked neighbors. Photographers found them. Journalists interviewed them. They became minor celebrities, not heroes, but symbols of defiant resilience. The attention felt good. The chaos felt like purpose, but storms always pass. Reality always returns. When New Orleans began its slow resurrection, Addie and Zack weren't ready. Bills piled up like accusation letters. Their jobs resumed, demanding punctuality and sobriety. The honeymoon phase, if it had ever truly existed, evaporated. Zack still loved his ex-wife. He missed his children with an ache that never dulled, but he didn't want to pay child support. He didn't want contact. He just wanted the grief without the responsibility. Addie sensed his distance. She demanded all of him, not just the parts he was willing to share. They argued constantly. They drank constantly. Cocaine became a regular guest at their table. The relationship didn't deteriorate, it detonated. In late 2006, walking down Rampart Street, they spotted a "For Rent" sign above the voodoo spiritual temple. Addie seized on it like a lifeline. A new apartment, a fresh start. Maybe they could salvage this wreckage. Zack agreed, though his heart wasn't in it. They moved in immediately. Within days, Addie caught him cheating. She exploded. She stormed to the landlord, Leo Watermeyer, demanding Zack's name be removed from the lease. She was done, finished over it. Leo bizarrely wrote her a handwritten contract suggesting they reconcile. Why he involved himself remains unclear. Perhaps he was a romantic, perhaps he was a fool. It was the last time anyone saw Addie Hall alive. Zack learned about the conversation from Leo shortly after. The rage that followed wasn't sudden, it had been building for months, but now it had a target. October 5th, 2006. Thursday, 1 a.m. The apartment was dark. They argued. Words became volume, then violence. Zack's hands found her throat, and he strangled her slowly, methodically. Halfway through, he paused and considered stopping, then continued. She died not screaming, but gurgling. What came next was worse than murder. He committed necrophilia with her corpse. Then he went to work the next morning like nothing had happened. Coworkers noticed he wore sunglasses indoors. He kept a hat pulled low. He barely spoke. They chalked it up to a hangover or a bad night. Over the following days, he dismembered her. He cut carefully, almost surgically. He even gave her a haircut, some twisted attempt at grooming or control. He seasoned her limbs before placing them in the oven. He arranged her head and extremities in pots. He shoved her torso in the fridge and told himself he'd deal with it later. Friends asked where Addie had gone. Zack had his story ready. She'd left him and returned to North Carolina. Some people were surprised, others weren't. Addie had always been impulsive, prone to sudden departures. No one suspected the truth. For 11 days, Zack lived with the evidence of his crime. He spent his remaining cash on food, drugs, strippers, and good times. He tied up loose ends. He didn't contact family. He wanted their shock to be genuine. He partied like a man counting down to execution, because he was. On October 16th, he wrote a final entry in Addie's journal. He confessed everything in neat handwriting and described the murder with chilling detachment. "I very calmly strangled her," he wrote. "It was very quick." He admitted he'd stopped halfway through, contemplated aborting, and then finished the job. What scared him wasn't the act itself, it was his complete lack of remorse. He spent his last day getting his affairs in order. Not legal affairs, but hedonistic ones. He went on one final binge before the end. Then he climbed to the roof of the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel. He stood at the edge and thought about Addie, about Lena, about his children, about the girl in Iraq. He thought about all the ways he'd failed. And then he jumped. The note in his pocket ensured they'd find her quickly. Perhaps that was his final gift, not making them searches. Or perhaps it was just one last exercise of control. Police worked the scene for hours. The smell was unforgettable. The images would haunt them for years. Forensic techs documented everything. The spray-painted walls, the seasoned limbs, the pots on the stove. They found no evidence of cannibalism. Stomach contents were tested, results negative. That detail offered no comfort. Friends and family reeled. Addie's parents learned their daughter had been murdered, dismembered, and cooked. Zack's ex-wife and children learned he'd become a monster. The city of New Orleans, still recovering from Katrina, absorbed another tragedy. The apartment above the Voodoo spiritual temple remained empty for years. No amount of sage or prayer could cleanse what had happened there. Addie Hall died because she loved a man incapable of love, not incapable of wanting, but incapable of the kind of reciprocal humanity that relationships require. She was 29 years old, an artist and a poet, a woman with mental illness who tried to navigate a world that gave her few tools. Zack Bowen died a coward, not brave enough to face consequences, but arrogant enough to choreograph his exit. His suicide wasn't redemption. It was just the final act of a man who decided his suffering mattered more than anyone else's. The case file closed. The headlines faded. The apartment eventually found new tenants who didn't ask about the history, but in true crime circles, the story endures. Not as cautionary tale, but as testament to how love and violence sometimes wear the same face. How trauma, untreated and festering, becomes a weapon. How the aftermath of disaster, Katrina, war, abuse creates conditions where horror thrives. Addie Hall deserved better. She deserved medication that worked and therapy that healed. She deserved a partner who saw her as human, not as emotional labor. She deserved to grow old, to create art, to find peace. As for Zack Bowen, he earned exactly what he got: oblivion, infamy, and a legacy of revulsion. The apartment above the Voodoo spiritual temple stands quiet now. The priests below still sell blessings and hexes. The quarter still thrums with music and chaos. Life continues, indifferent. But if you walk past 826 North Rampart late at night, when the tourists have stumbled home and the streets belong to shadows, some say you can still smell seasoning in the air. Not real, but remembered. Not haunting, but indelible. It was the kind of smell that doesn't wash away, the kind of story that doesn't let go. If you enjoyed this, drop a like, subscribe, tap the bell, and stick around for more. Goodbye and good night.